Great. I think we're ready. So, welcome everyone to our ClimaTalk event today called Spotlight on International Carbon Markets, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. First of all, I would like to present ClimaTalk to you because maybe not all of you have have met us yet. We write short and accessible articles about climate policy. Here you can see some examples. So we're basically trying to demystify everything around international climate policies. For example, the Conference of the Parties, the UNFCCC, the IPCC. So everything around international climate policy, we try to make it accessible for everyone and write it in a short and comprehensive way. Also, these events are, of course, part of our educational activism, let's say, in order to bring you together with experts from the field so you can ask your questions that really matter to you. So I'm really happy that we can talk with you today. Feel also free to follow us on our different channels. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and on YouTube, where you will also find this meeting or the recording of this meeting afterwards. Yeah, but let's dive a little bit into the topic. There will be 2 presentations today, so I won't tell too much about the topic, but maybe give you a little insight what we're gonna be talking about. Maybe not everyone has heard of the Paris Agreement yet. So the Paris Agreement is kind of an international agreed document where governments across the world commit to address the climate crisis through ambitious target setting. It is a legally binding international treaty within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which addresses climate change adaptation, mitigation, and climate finance. It was adopted in 2015 by 196 parties at COP21 and entered into force in 2016. The goal is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. And one article of this international agreement is Article 6. Which is an interesting article because while most of the sections of the Paris Agreement have been agreed, well, not rapidly, but more rapidly than Article 6, there's some, there was some trouble to agree on Article 6, but we will hear more about that, I think, from Karin and Aglaya, our speakers tonight. And I don't want to talk too much about it yet because I think we will dive deeper into that in the presentations. So I just want to present who are we talking with tonight. First of all, we have Dr. Karin Olsen here. She's a senior researcher in the Impact Assessment and Adaptation Analysis section at UNFCCC Partnership in Copenhagen. She has 15 years of work experience with climate and sustainable development in developing countries, and currently she leads the Sustainable Development Initiatives on the implementation of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement under the UNFCCC, jointly with the gold standard, focusing on technical analysis and policy dialogue for negotiators to operationalize the rulebook for new market mechanisms in the Paris Agreement. You have to tell us more about that later, Karin. Very interesting. And we also have here Aglaya Espelage. Aglaya recently graduated from the binational master's degree in applied political science at the University of Freiburg in Germany and the EIP in Aix-en-Provence in France. During her academic and vocational training, she worked on sustainable development, development cooperation, and climate change policy. And she joined Perspectives Climate Group in 2017 as a consultant and project manager on carbon markets and current developments in the market mechanisms, especially related to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. welcome you too. We are very delighted and happy to have you here tonight. And I'm really excited to hear about your views on Article 6, your work, and all the information that you're going to give us now during your presentations. So I want to hand over to Karen, because she's gonna be presenting first. And I would say, Karen, the floor is yours. You're free to share your presentation.
Thank you, Leonie. And I believe we are even colleagues from UNFDTU, or you were with UNFDTU for some time at least.
Yes, exactly.
and sorry for asking these questions, but we've been sort of working from home for a year now. So you sort of look familiar, but then not that familiar. How long were you there?
Yes, I worked as a research fellow for 6 months at UNFCCC.
6 months, yeah, that explains.
Exactly.
So we're on our way back to office and a new normal, whatever that will be. But let me share my screen. There it is. I have a presentation. And this is, what is this? Is this Zoom?
Yes, that should work.
Zoom.
Perfect.
Yeah. Good. You see my screen. Which screen do you see? Do you see full screen or do you see presentation mode?
Presentation
need to
mode.
switch.
You see presentation mode. Yeah. So I don't know how to do that. It's because I'm a guest and not a host.
You can change display settings, I guess, and then you can switch screens.
Display settings.
Ah, they're on top. Just right above the presentation. But otherwise, I think it's also fun. Like,
it works.
We can see your presentation.
A little bit annoying. Yeah. Otherwise, where do you say the display settings are?
It should be on the screen where you have the presentation mode, and then next to show taskbar.
Oh yeah, on top of the screen.
On top of the screen, left corner.
Yes, show taskbar.
And then right next to it, it's display settings.
Oh,
and there you should be able, to switch.
Swap.
Yeah, swap.
Oh, thank you.
I had that problem once. So.
I did it with perspectives with many participants, and I didn't know the quick solution was to unplug the big screen, and which means with my glasses I couldn't see the little LED. Yeah. So thanks for this. I hope you see the big screen now. So I almost chose the same title as you did, Leonie, Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, and you have briefed us, the two speakers, to tell me that I should not talk about the crunch issues in the negotiations because Aglaya will cover that. So then I will not talk about the crunch issues. I would, however, like to share that coming out of a 2-hour session today with negotiators, Article 6 negotiators, including the co-chairs, I took note that they said negotiators have started singing the same song. And this is positive. It means when you ask negotiators, how likely is it we're going to have a rule book in Glasgow this year? We've tried for 5 years, or maybe not 5 years, was it 3 years? So we've tried for a number of years and failed. And the sentiment is that we are perhaps 90% likely to have an outcome, to have a rule book. I look forward to your presentation, Aglaya, on what remains. But what I will do here is to cover a little bit of the history and the rationale, why carbon markets matter. Why is it so difficult for parties to agree? They've agreed on so many other things, so why not the markets? And then last, what role does UNFDTU play? What is our contribution to the carbon markets? But first, since you showed that to some, this is a new topic, what is Article 6? And to the right, there's this table on unpacking what it is. I don't know if you read it. The Paris Agreement is short, just 25 pages or so. So Article 6 is perhaps 1 page. And in the preamble, so it's just from a text perspective, it's maybe 1 page that we're trying to unpack. How do we implement this? I mean, how do we define rules? That's maybe many more pages, definitely. But the preamble sets unitary objectives, and it states that using cooperative approaches is voluntary, and the overall objective is to allow for higher ambition of the national determined contributions of parties. The objective is also has dual objectives. It's also to promote sustainable development and ensure environmental integrity. This has to do with accounting. But there are 3 articles. 2 of them are related to trading in ITMOs, International Traded Mitigation Outcomes. And the 3rd one, known as the Framework and Work Program, the Article 6.8, for non-market approaches. So this is more cooperative. It doesn't have to do with markets, but it's still important as a framework. It could be, for instance, agreement to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. There are many important elements here. And it's important particularly to the Latin American countries who have a history of not really having markets close to their hearts. They talk a lot about Mother Nature, and pricing nature is difficult, and they have their reservations toward use of market mechanisms. But the other 2, 6.2, cooperative approaches, 6.4, also known as the mechanism or the Sustainable Development Mechanism. The rule book that we are waiting for will provide guidance in 6.2 for cooperative approaches. These are the ITMO transactions across jurisdictions. It's also, in terms of governance, a bottom-up national determined. Some say that if we were to fail again, cooperation could still take place under 6.2. It's actually happening right now. Whereas the Article 6.4, the Sustainable Development Mechanism, where rules, modalities, and procedures will be decided in the rulebook, it's more of a top-down CDM, like what we know from the Kyoto Protocol, under the guidance of the supervisory body. And the relationship between the 2, maybe Aglaya will talk more about it, but this is still controversial. Parties have quite different views and understandings how the 2 will work together. So we can't go into too many details here, but maybe just on the history, how international carbon markets have developed over time, starting from the Kyoto Protocol. Yeah, so one of the crunch issues is, what about CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism? How will it transition into Article 6? What gets transitioned? Is it the credits? Is it the methodologies? Is it the governance setup? What is it that gets transitioned? And this remains a major crunch issue to some. Brazil, for instance, I think it was on a top 10 of exports in terms of their national GDP. It was significant, and it remains so. So to some, it's just not it's to the EU. It's about ambition raising. Kyoto was one era, Paris is another era, and the main focus now is the race to zero. So the transition of CDM and the history of what we come from remains one of the crunch issues. But the new thing, and why it is so important, the role of carbon markets, and I have added here transparency, because there are close links between Article 6 and 13 in the Paris Agreement. Article 13 is about transparency and accounting, and that, I would say, this is the infrastructure for trading in ITMOs. But the new thing is that after IPCC report 2018, where the science tells us we need to go to net zero by 2050, there has been high-level champions, secretariat, parties, private sector, what is known as the race to zero. And that changes the nature of how carbon markets work. We're changing focus from emission reductions, that's the blue area, to a focus on removals, to go to net zero and even negative emissions. And the role of transparency, and here comes another sort of statement. Transparency is very important with regard to the MRV and accounting frameworks. Also key for the credibility of what parties say they do in terms of achieving their NDCs, and for emissions trading. And what we see is that it's how you say, mushrooming. It's more and more countries are going for domestic emissions trading schemes. Essentially, it's about pricing carbon. It could be tax, it could be emissions trading, but pricing carbon is increasingly becoming important. And more jurisdictions from the supranationals, such as the EU, more and more countries, provinces, states, and cities are introducing emissions trading, so that we are at global level have 54% of the global GDP are capped or covered by emissions trading schemes. So the ITMOs, International Traded Mitigation Outcomes, are the units of emission reductions and removals that are then created and then has to be accounted for and traded using the market mechanisms. They are in sort of history, and also it remains so, the main uses for compliance with the NDC targets. But we see from the voluntary carbon market and also from COSIA covering airlines that there are also demands coming from companies and from other users for use to comply with the net zero targets or neutrality targets. And that's also quite a jungle because they're different. They sound similar, but they're technically different, and the implications of technically different can be profound. But this is just to say that there are multiple claims being made for use of ITMOs, and the main thing across jurisdictions, for an offset, you need a corresponding adjustment. So not going into the rule book, but rather looking at what is happening on the ground. This is a map of pilot initiatives by multiple stakeholders, such as the Nordic countries, Japan, the Joint Crediting Mechanism, CLIC Foundation, the Swiss, the banks, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and many others. So it's, and I just heard today among the negotiators that capacity building to enable more countries to implement Article 6, it's getting into the negotiations so that there may be mandated some requirements for capacity building, which is what someone like UNFDTU, that's our bread and butter, so to say. That's what we do for a living. Yeah, and that actually takes me to who we are and what we do. UNFDTU Partnership. We are anchored at the Technical University of Denmark, but we closely collaborate with UN Environment Program. We're based in Copenhagen with around 70 scientists, very multidisciplinary from many countries, because our mandate is to support developing countries. That's the house. We support developing countries in their efforts to progress towards climate resilient and low carbon development. And the bottom of the house, which is our strategic framework, is that we provide research-based analysis and capacity building in 3 strategic areas. I won't go into that because it's not only about Article 6, it's much more. But on top of the house, you see that we relate to 3 of the 17 SDGs: energy, climate, and partnerships, and sustainable development. But those are the goals. So in terms of research and examples of my own research, which is in the area of sustainability transition, we draw on frameworks such as transition management, multi-level perspective, and a more new approach is planetary boundaries. Johan Rockström also taking into the perspective of the social foundation, not only environmental aspects, but also social economic aspects, for an absolute approach to sustainability assessment. So we do papers, journal papers, as researchers. I was going to say on the side, because the bread and butter is actually our projects, capacity building projects. But examples of analysis is that we have an Article 6 pipeline. We used to have CDM pipeline, pledge pipeline, many pipelines, databases on these activities, also the CDM pipeline on projects. And now we have the Article 6 pipeline to track what is going on. And we develop methodologies. I have myself been leading the transformational change methodology under the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, and also for sustainable development impact assessment, which is also useful for markets. And projects, transparency, ICAT, they are very large, multi-donor, multi-partner, multi-country, 35 countries or so. No, that was millions of euros. But that also goes for the countries, many countries. And together with perspectives, we're doing a research and analysis on transformational design for markets. There's the Sustainable Development Initiative with gold standards. We support also the technology mechanism on transformational impact assessment, and we're starting up a new capacity building initiative for the German government called the Initiative for Climate Action Transparent, ICI. Initiative, International Climate Initiative is what it is. I think that was my last slide. Over to you, Leonie.
Thank you very much, Karen, for this technical overview. Now maybe Aglaya, you can share your screen and go more into the, how do you call it, the crunch topics.
Yes, just from an early look at Karen's slide, I thought maybe I can focus a bit more on the negotiation process right now that we've learned what it's about, and give maybe a little outlook to COP26. So parties are, since Article 6 was put into the Paris Agreement, parties are thinking about its rulebook, meaning the words that were fought over under the Paris Agreement now need to come to life. And this is what, parties are talking about since COP22. And what happened is it was supposed to be adopted together with the rules on transparency more in general and many other rules, and it wasn't because parties failed to agree. And what we see is that parties keep on talking about it, and hopefully now this year, as Karen said, parties are at a stage where they understand each other well enough to get to a compromise. But of course, those were very complicated talks and take a lot of time. So I just wanted to a bit explain how negotiations under the Paris Agreement work. So parties that have ratified the Paris Agreement or signed the Paris Agreement, they become parties to the Paris Agreement. And they meet at this international conference, which is called the Conference of the Parties. And there they discuss the matters related to that. But usually These conferences, there are two types of it. There are the technical talks and there are the political talks. And usually there's twice a year a meeting of the technical talks, which is organized by so-called subsidiary bodies. This is the subsidiary body for implementation and the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice. And this one is where parties get together to discuss the technical details on Article 6. And this is supposed to prepare the political decision when in the second week of the big conference, then usually in the end of the year, the ministers and heads of delegations get together and they sign the deal and adopt the rules. They are supposed to do the little groundwork. Good. So we know that the last round of political deals failed in Madrid at COP25. And what laid on the table is what is referred to as the Article 6 rulebook. And that refers to the guidance on cooperative approaches, the rules, modalities, procedures of the Article 6.4 mechanism. So the two main rules for carbon markets, as Karen just explained, as well as the work program on non-market approaches, which are pushed by those that are not in favor of markets. Good. So we had a failure of the political talks. And since then, it was supposed to continue with the technical talks, but then the pandemic came and everything was being delayed. Now, the Substat chair, so there's always one designated person to lead this discussion and to convene the parties. He said, okay, we will do a series of technical informal dialogues. Those have now been going on. There was one in November and now a new one since March, where parties come together in a virtual format and they discuss key issues with the hope of, it's a lot of sharing of views. And of course, everyone's just repeating their positions. But the idea is that through talking and talking and talking, eventually someone changes a little bit their position and a common understanding is being built. So it's a lot of talking before one gets to something. But that was the process. And it was quite an interesting process. It was the first time that this was so virtual, and it actually was quite transparent, something I just want to note, because one could watch these talks in webcasts. And non-party stakeholders could even do submissions. So that, it's usually quite difficult to influence UN talks from a non-party stakeholder perspective, but I actually found the process quite transparent, which is always good. There was even a session where accredited observers, like research institutions, or there's also a bit they could even talk directly to the negotiators. So that is quite a good thing. So now there was like an intensified period of technical talks with the virtual meeting of these bodies just in June. It just concluded. And what came out of it is, okay, we now need more politicians to come in. We have identified where the current issues lie. We have identified where negotiators, which are ministry employees, cannot go beyond their positions because they need some political signal from above that they can actually move. So now there will be ministerial talks hosted by the COP presidency, so the UK, and Chile, which is the outgoing COP presidency, and also by Singapore and Japan on Article 6 specifically. And the idea is to prepare the work for a decision in COP. And what we will see is the first week of COP, there will be the technical talks. And then the question is, what kind of text gets put forward to the ministers? Good. So what we see now in these talks, there was quite a nice engagement, which is maybe doesn't sound like much, but in negotiations, it's already worth something if everyone talks to each other and keeps listening. So that was good, but there was very little movement on the position. So I thought from a negotiation point of view, and as we're talking about COP, I just explain a bit what the key issues are for the parties that are quite active here. We have the EU, and Karen already said it, it's really for them about having a transparent market, transparent cooperation, with clear accounting rules. And that means specifically no double counting, saying that if now one country was selling their mitigation, so what they have reduced in their territory to another country, then the host country, the originator country, couldn't claim the same mitigation then for its NDC target, because the idea is that through accounting, it is ensured that the global perspective and how many emissions there are and how much mitigation was achieved, needs to sum up. It needs to be equal. Nothing should be double counted. So that is very important for them. And they want to have a really, a turn away from the Kyoto Protocol towards the Paris Agreement with a more forward-looking, they always say forward-looking engagement. How can we reach the Paris Agreement? How do we get from where we are to where we should go, instead of the Kyoto Protocol, and especially the Clean Development Mechanism, which was defined in a time where developing countries had no targets. So it was just assumed that they would keep polluting, and everything they did was counted towards mitigation. And the EU says, no, we now have all targets. So not everything which is better than the status quo can be called mitigation. It needs to be something which is in line with where we need to get in terms of emission levels. Quite active in the negotiations also the Independent Alliance of Latin American States, which are a few states in Latin America and Caribbean. They have also quite a strong focus on transparency, decarbonization, and sustainable development, and they have quite a stark interest in carbon pricing themselves. So in these many Latin American countries that are open to carbon markets have really been developing their capacities there, and emission trading systems and carbon taxes. And so they have a vested interest in getting good rules that they can then use domestically as well, or connect to each other their own emission trading systems. Then there is the Alliance of Small Island States. And usually small island states had really very little engagement in the carbon markets in the past, because if you don't have a lot of emissions, you also cannot sell a lot of mitigation. And then you cannot really benefit from them. At the same time, they're of course highly vulnerable. So what they want, they push for rules that allow markets to go beyond just a zero-sum game. So I sell you 1 ton of mitigation, and then you can offset of emissions. They want what they call an overall mitigation in global emissions, saying that you need to buy more credits than the emissions that you are offsetting. That is really important to them. Also, that there is a levy on all sorts of carbon market generations, and that then leads to finance for adaptation. And of course, they want capacity building, and that there's special circumstances, that they have limited, possibilities of engaging, and also often limited resources, that this is recognized. Very similar to the LDC group, the least developed countries, which have even a stronger focus on share of proceeds. And then there is the African group, which largely overlaps to some extent with the LDC group as well, also push for share of proceeds for adaptation. And they specifically want that all carbon market action that is international generates adaptation finance, and not just, as most parties agree, the UN mechanism to be established. They want everything. And that would, for instance, also affect transactions between the EU and the Swiss in the emissions trading system. And they want that all these transactions deliver an adaptation finance. So that is a major point for them. And they have a big call for capacity building. Why? Under Kyoto Protocol, these countries have come in very late in the mechanisms, and they have just started to build their capacities and register their projects at a point in time where prices crashed and everyone abandoned the markets. So they have invested a lot, but not really benefited from it so far. So they say, we have built our capacities, and what we have put in, we need to ensure that we can continue that route, and that we can benefit from finance through carbon markets. And they also want that the activities they have managed to register under the CDM can easily transition to the new mechanism. So, they don't have that big hurdles of engagement again, and everything they build up. That's really important. Now, we have a group of countries, China, India, Brazil, who are really dominant in the CDM, and they also have a very strong interest that their activities and partly also the credits that were already generated are somehow made of value in the new market, which is rejected by others. Because they say, no, this new market, and lingering around with all credits won't help us get anywhere. But point, and especially also the like-minded developing countries and the Arab group, they push for consideration of all NDCs. They have often NDCs that don't have quantification targets, or they don't have, it's not, they don't say I'll reduce so much tons. They just say, okay, I'll put in so and so much solar panels, or this and this much megawatt installed capacity of renewable energy. And they don't want to be obliged to quantify that in mitigation and have that assessed internationally to be able to participate in carbon markets. So there's a lot of problems there that they don't want to see that that happening. Then we have the so-called umbrella group with the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And they also quite strong focus on transparency and accounting. They have a very strong focus also on the voluntary carbon market. So how does the private sector come in? And how does this link to offsetting possibilities for the private sector and or airlines under other schemes? So they have a very strong interest in that. And last, there is a group of countries that rejects carbon markets, and that is specifically spearheaded by Bolivia. They have already fought for the non-market approaches to be put in the Article 6 agreement as the Paris Agreement, and now they fight that this article gets a lot of attention. They want to see not just the work program to see on synergies, what is now foreseen, but they want really to have like a mechanism which provides finance for very specific approaches that they are promoting, which is rejected by many others. It must be understood that Article 6 is, of course, not being negotiated in a vacuum. So there are like broader topics around it. Like, how does the Paris Agreement connect to what the countries and the governments are doing, and how does it connect to things that the private sector is doing or other international regimes are doing? There's a huge fight or big a lot of discussion on transparency. How does this connect with how transparent one can assess what the ambition level of the governments are, how much mitigation they have actually achieved, how much they have exported of that, what are they allowed to export, what does it mean, what do they need to make transparent? And of course, what finance will actually flow. And what we see is that there's a lot of discussion on carbon markets, not so much demand yet from the compliance market point of view. It's mostly the voluntary carbon market, which brings the demand for carbon credits and so on, which is driving that. So a lot of discussion of how much finance will countries get, and will it be finance for mitigation or also finance for adaptation? And last but not least, and Karen already said that there's a lot of links to the capacity building, because the past teach that countries with limited capacities did not have good opportunities for engaging and accessing the financial opportunities in low emissions development. Good. This is just a summary. Those are the remaining crunch issues. It relates to accounting. It relates to the credits. It relates to what is a carbon credit and when can I claim what mitigation is. How much do I need to set aside for overall mitigation and global emission? And is a ton on offset, can I offset with that a ton of emissions or can I not? How much adaptation finance comes out of these mechanisms, and how inclusive the rules are, or let's say otherwise, how harmonized are they? What are the common accounting rules, and where there are national exceptions? But I also think that there was quite a good of progress. One party's now talked on how can we set up a good mechanism to generate carbon credits, what information needs to be reported, and how can the process work from activities from the old mechanisms to move to the new mechanism. So I'm sorry for pressing so much information in very limited time, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Aglaya, also for your presentation. Maybe now, yeah, perfect. Now we're back to the stage, the virtual stage. And I have a question, just because I'm so overwhelmed by all the information, and because you were talking a lot about the importance of transparency. I was wondering, all of these topics are quite complex and probably difficult to understand, especially maybe for people who don't have the educational background, who probably don't speak English, who don't have enough access to information. So what is done to bring this topic closer to those people, to make it more transparent? Not sure who wants to start. Aglaya?
Yes, I can start with yeah, I think that the Article 6 discussions are among the most technical and where there's the least work done to ensure that everyone can follow them. But I think we do try from time to time to publish papers that explain the background very well. And I know that UNFTTU is also a great source of information for these kinds of, if one wants to read about things. But yeah, just to say that it's not just for lay people, it's actually a huge challenge for many countries' delegations to the negotiations. And there is a large, there is like a gap of especially Francophone speaking countries and how they can engage in the UNFCCC negotiations. And I do see that in my day-to-day work, that it can be a major barrier for smaller countries to engage meaningfully in negotiations and make their voices heard, especially when they come from non-English speaking countries. So they have very few people that are actually negotiating, and then they are, have so many meetings, it's difficult to follow. They don't speak the language. And what we are trying to do, for instance, is that there's the Institut de la Francophonie, and they publish a French guide to the negotiations every year. And I do think that is quite important, these kinds of non-state work, to make sure that everyone has an equal chance to understand what's going on, and it's not just for lay people. That's what I wanted to say.
Absolutely. Thank you for the elaboration. And I know, Karin, that UNFTTU partnership is also working on transparency. So maybe you also want to comment on that point.
Yes, we have in the past translated guidebooks languages. It's common practice when we do capacity building to have interpretation. I think during COVID-19, when we could not travel, for Vietnam, where English is a barrier, particularly for the sort of the elder people. I think young people are increasingly quite good in English, also in Vietnam, but the senior people sometimes struggle with the language. So we used to have the resources to have simultaneous translation. All COP events are translated into all the UN languages. And I've also seen in a couple of webinars that I was not responsible myself, but for instance, in a workshop with Peru, that was very efficient. But this was also they were professional communications people for a living. It was super professional, and the instant translation to Spanish just worked very well, also virtually. But it came late. I think it was maybe 6 months into the lockdown that I saw the first sort of translations, instant translations. We tend to just skip it but that comes at a cost. So I think language is something to be mindful of. And that's just the language. Then it's also the communication in general, explaining these very technical issues in a language that other people than the experts understand. Which is why I'm sitting here. I think it's a great initiative that you have, because it's as until you're exposed as a student. I mean, you can't understand everything the first time. I'm just when I myself get into new topics, I'm just happy for the 10% that I understand. And then gradually, when you've been here for 20 years, you understand more and more over time. But you won't get everything the first time, for sure. And nobody does. Even if you've been here 20 years, 30 years, nobody understands everything. We all understand our little piece of the world.
Absolutely. Hopefully this discussion sparks a little bit the interest in getting to know more about Article 6 on a personal level, which leads to my next question.
Just a sec, somebody's knocking on.
Oh, maybe Aglaia, then you can answer this question. So all of these discussions and negotiations set around Article 6 they seem to happen on a very high political level. What kind of consequences does this international carbon market discussion have for our own personal lives?
That is not an easy question to answer. I think the idea of Article 6 is that by allowing countries to cooperate to reach their targets. So the idea behind carbon markets is that, it's not possible, like the opportunities for mitigation are not distributed evenly across the globe. In one country, there may not be that much funding, but they have maybe an older technology that can better be replaced with new one if there would be funding, and then there would be a mitigation effect, whereas in other countries it would already be very costly because the technologies are not there yet for that kind of solution. So, the idea of the carbon market is to prioritize the mitigation there where it's best achievable. That is the idea, and thereby contribute to finance flows where it makes most sense. I think that is the very ambitious goal, and the underlying idea of why one would make carbon markets for climate action. And so the impact for our lives, if the markets are well designed, is that parties or countries or governments may be able faster to adopt more ambitious targets, because either they have received finance through carbon markets that have lowered the emission levels, so it's easier for them to do the next step, or to implement the technologies, to ensure that private sectors on board and no jobs are lost, or because they instead of increasing the pressure on the private sector at home, allow them to buy comparatively cheaper credits then, and thereby achieve mitigation elsewhere would not have been possible domestically. So if carbon markets were used as that kind of tool and as an ambition raising tool, if one wants to use that language, that would be the plus side. Then there is the minus side. If we have carbon markets where tons are double counted, where there is no clarity if what is being transferred as mitigation actually had a real impact on the ground, then it may actually do the exact opposite. It may lead to that on the paper everything looks nicely, while in fact we're not getting to where we should be going. That is on the carbon markets. And then we also have the non-market approaches in the Article 6, which are about better harnessing synergies and being more efficient in other means of international collaboration. And I do think also that article should not be forgotten. There's a lot to think about how all forms of international collaboration can be better harmonized and thought together to deliver that goal. So potentially benefits, potentially risks. And there's also like this, if the UN adopts certain rules, it then also has an impact of how voluntary carbon markets work, or other international efforts, for instance, in the shipping sector, in the air travel sector, how they do this carbon market approaches. And that can have potentially a very good impact. But yeah, it also has risks. Maybe Karen wants to comment on that, but I think that's a very high level answer to that question.
No worries. I think you answered that question quite well. Maybe a question for Karen, because that came from our audience. We were already talking a little bit about the national carbon market. So the question is, could there be multiple types of carbon markets, or does it have to be one size fits it all solution? Maybe Karen, you want to start with that one?
They are diverse already. Which gases are covered, which sectors are covered. National emissions trading schemes are very diverse. So having one global carbon market, it's in the future. It's gonna take a while.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you want to add something? You or you're good. Okay. We also have a little bit more technical questions, maybe. So there's also the question: what role will carbon capture and storage play in Article 6? Whoever's first.
I can have a first try that. So the draft rules that parties are talking about explicitly say that it relates to both emission reductions and emission removals, like the mitigation outcomes that can then be internationally traded. So carbon capture and storage could be one action that is then implemented in one country, and where the credits, like the storage credits, are then transferred internationally. And there are even some bit more rules on that already in the text, like, you know, but it's the same for that the removal must be permanent, and there will be further rules to determine what that means. If there must be, you know, some integrity safeguards, and I would believe that parties would then continue to discuss how to do that. I know that under the CDM there were already some carbon storage methodologies as well, not widely applied, but it is something which definitely I think is something that might be a technological solution to be implemented and financed by carbon markets. But as of now, it is mostly too expensive. So it's being done in a few pilot projects, or it's mostly being financed as of now by other means. The key question is then, you know, how it is being accounted for. There are some issues with the IPCC guidelines and how the rules will be set to account for that. And another question will be, you know, what will be the balance between emission reductions and emission removals, and until when will we be prioritizing emission reductions, and from when onwards will we put our efforts more into the removal space. And that also relates to the role that forestry plays in carbon markets. So
there's also a question about removals and reductions, so maybe I can ask that and you can comment on that as well. So how would carbon removals be kept separate from emission reductions in the carbon market?
There are some that say that it should be different units, which are then labeled differently. And, you know, there are some accounting rules attached to it. But that really depends on the approach taken. Under the CDM, for instance, for forestry units, you had these temporary credits that would expire after a certain time, and you would need to replace them with new credits from forestry projects. But that wasn't really attractive for buyers. And in the voluntary carbon markets, you had these buffer registries, and if the forest burned down, you would use some credits from this buffer. It's not something that is being thought through yet at the UN level with rules, and there would be rules to ensure that transparency on the underlying mitigation is done, and how that relates to accounting then in the inventories. But Karen, maybe you want to add on that.
It's just that I feel that Article 6 is so much about rules, modalities, procedures, and I think from my perspective, social science, I think that what is more interesting about Paris is that we are now upscaling mitigation actions. We're moving from projects and programs to upscaling policy-based crediting. And we are also seeing new types of activities that can be credited, for instance, in the transport sector, which are more related to behavioral changes, not only technology fixes. I think there's a lot of sort of wishful thinking around removals, that we'll have these new carbon capture storage technology fixes. And the thing about it is that they're really expensive now. And I think if you look at the IPCC, you can't see it yet. It's because I've been reviewing the IPCC 6 assessment report, but there's a new chapter in it on demand side, which looks at how do we get to the 1.5 degree, the pathway there. And what has not been looked at so much in the past, neither CDM Kyoto Protocol, because it was so rules sort of oriented. What about the social aspects, the behavioral changes? And this is where, when you do scenarios, this is where you see the biggest mitigation potential. This is looking into non-motorized transport don't eat meat. You could call it social technologies. And I'm just personally a little bit sort of, God, do we have to agree everything into the nitty-gritty details at the international level? Again, we'll never agree on these things. And I think that the race to zero is more about the sort of norms and behaviors and the social aspects of climate change. And I would really welcome you, the young ones, and not just technical people, but also social science people to engage in climate change. I'm myself a social scientist, and I just don't think that we'll achieve what we need to achieve if we just look at technologies and rules. We need that. I'm just saying we also need more. And there are many, I mean, the race to zero, it's has momentum. And I think we're seeing forest fires in the US where I mean, I think people are scared now. How bad climate change is, how quick it is. And I think that we also, for markets, we need to find new ways of looking into ways of rewarding change, system change towards what gives us the most, both emission reductions and removals. And it's not only technologies, it's also behavioral changes. And we haven't looked much at that yet. I hope we can have also more discussion on these issues, which to some extent go under the heading of sustainable development, because that's catch-all. Market people used to not like to talk about it at all, because they thought it was a distraction from all the rules. I'm speaking in my personal capacity here, but it's just that I feel that there is increasingly from people like your colleagues, Aglaya, perspectives, people that know the methodologies so well, that there is an increasing interest also in sustainable development aspects of transformative design of the more soft parts that I personally believe will have much bigger impact. And I'm not saying it's one or the other, I'm saying it's both. That's my point. I mean, we need carbon capture and we need everything. We need absolutely everything that we can do to get to net zero and negative as quick as possible. And markets, I personally believe, are powerful. I think they are so tricky, but that's because they are if you get it right, it can speed up. We engage private sector. It's going to speed up the transition, and we badly need it.
Thank you, Karen, for highlighting this aspect. As a social scientist myself, working with sustainable development, that's it's really good to hear.
There's a role for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, now I have there's a lot more questions, but time is running. So I have one more question, which maybe is easy to answer or not so easy. Let's see. But it's probably a good final question. So would you say that a net zero future needs to feature a carbon market in some capacity, or can we reach it without one?
Sorry, could you say, I didn't get it quite clearly. Could you say it again?
So would you say that a net zero future needs to feature a carbon market in some capacity, or can we reach it without one? Maybe that's a one sentence answer.
I think there are two ways to answer that. The one thing is what role carbon markets can play until we get to net zero, in accelerating and speeding up and channeling finance. And the other thing is, if we now think we're in a net zero, what does net zero mean? It usually means we will have some emissions and we will have some sinks, and hopefully that's sums up to zero, and that needs to stay that way, or we even need to become net negative. And that means that the capacities for storing and removing carbon will be not evenly distributed around the world. And I'm speaking both natural capacities as well as technical capacities. Now, if we want to call it a carbon market or not, but we will need to have some global perspective on what is being emitted and what is being stored. And they're having good rules of how we measure and how we account for mitigation will be needed. Whether it's now the emissions trading that we're seeing today, that's an open question. But I think that these rules matter even in the very long term. Now I'm speaking a lot about rules again. Sorry, Karen, but I'm just thinking about, at some point in stage, we don't have all the opportunities distributed evenly, and carbon markets can look very differently. It can be government to government, it can be with the private sector, but I do think, that international cooperation aspect will remain.
Rules are enabling. Rules are super important. Without the rules, everybody needs to sort of invent the plate themselves. So the rules are clearly enabling. It's just I see that there's, and I heard it today among the negotiators, that if you try to perfect the rules for particular interests, the perfect comes at the expense of the good, even having any rules, because it's so complex. And if you try to perfect for ambition raising, for instance, which is the objective, you may lose some parties that then put a stick in the wheel and you lose everything again. So it's finding that compromise. So the question, can we achieve net zero without carbon markets? Can we achieve it with carbon markets? We're trying. And I think that the reason that the engaging private sector and NDC implementation, providing the mechanisms for doing that, is that if you look at developing country governments, many are weak. They have limited capacity, limited incentives. And when you engage private sector, you engage both finance, but you also engage the minds and the skills. And I think what I like so much about markets is that you engage many stakeholders, you decentralize in a way. You don't concentrate power with government and put responsibility only on government. You disperse both opportunities and responsibilities to private sector, to also NGOs and so on. So having since Kyoto and until we're sort of getting started with markets, there was a lot of focus on NAMAs, national appropriate mitigation actions, that were policies by governments. And in my experience, that was mainly talk, little action. And I believe carbon markets can bring action to the talk, so to say, walk the talk. That's why I believe in markets. I think we need them for net zero.
Yeah, these are good closing words, Karen, and you really made your point with that. Yeah, Karen and Aglaya, I want to thank you very much for being here today and giving us an insight in what Article 6 is, what are the different topics. And I think it was a very, very nice discussion, very interesting questions that came from our audience as well. So thank you very much also to the audience, those who stayed until the end. So we will close the recording now.